Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. Get this cord fixed up here. Thank you, Mr. David. Let's go to God in prayer, and we'll begin in our class. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, God, that you have blessed us with, and just grateful, God, for this first day of the week. Thankful, God, for this time that you have allowed us to spend together studying your word, Father, and we're just grateful for those opportunities, God, that you bless us with. Thank you so much, God, for the book of Exodus and the things that we can learn from this book, God. We're grateful for this time that we've been able to spend together studying from your word. Heavenly Father, we look forward to the time this morning, if it be in your will, that we can spend together worshiping you. God, we look forward to being able to worship you in spirit and in truth. We look forward, God, to being able to honor and praise you. We look forward, God, to singing songs of praise. We look forward, God, to being able to petition you in prayer. We look forward, God, to being able to receive a message from our brother Terry as he speaks to us from your word, God. And God, we look forward to being able to commune around the Lord's table and be able to remember the sacrifice that your Son made for us, God. And we're grateful, Father, that you have, through him, offered us salvation, God, that you have blessed us with a free gift. God, thank you for your mercy and for your grace and for all the good things that you do for us. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're at chapter 39 of the book of Exodus. We'll finish up this study next week. We're in verse 22. I want to remind everybody that in 2 weeks from today that the gentleman will be here. I can't think of his name right off the top of my head, but the gentleman will be here from Lads to Leaders, and he's he'll take over the Bible class, and he'll also have the sermon for the morning. That'll be in 2 weeks because we're gonna renew that program. We hadn't been involved in it since COVID year 2020. We were heavily involved up until that point, and so we're going to start that back up because it's a wonderful program. It's a great training tool for our young people and adults. Did y'all know that? Not just for young people. Anybody else know that other than me? They changed some things since we've been in it, where it's still centered around developing young people, but it's also got some stuff in it now that the adults can do. So, great program. So make sure you avail yourself to that information. And then Terry, in 3 weeks, first Sunday in March, he'll begin Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So you're up to date. Let's look at verses 22 through 26. If you remember last week, the last thing we discussed and talked about was the breast piece, right? Yeah. Does anybody remember anything specific about that breast piece? It had something attached to it. What now? Somebody said it. 12 stones, okay? And those stones had what on them? Okay? Names of the 12 tribes, okay? So let's read 22 through 26. This is Exodus chapter 39. Then he made the robe of the ephod of woven work, all of blue, and the opening of the robe was at the top in the center, as the opening of a coat of mail, with a binding all around this opening so that it would not be torn. They made pomegranates of blue and purple and a scarlet material and twisted linen on the hem of the robe. They also made bells of pure gold and put the bells between the pomegranates all around on the hem of the robe, alternating a bell and a pomegranate all around on the hem of the robe for the service And here it is again, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. You know, we've been paying attention to that specific line while we've been reading, right? Just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So the fact that the high priest's robe is called the robe of the what? Y'all done forgot already? 22? The robe of the ephod, okay? We read about that in chapter 28 and verse 31, and we just read it again in verse 22. And that suggests that the ephod was the most important part of his apparel, okay? The ephod, more than anything else, differentiated the high priest from the other priests and the worshipers, okay? The robe was a plain blue garment that was worn under the ephod. The most unusual thing about it was it had was the pomegranates, okay? Most likely, I would say probably woven into the hem, and the bells attached to the hem, okay? We would consider that to be a little unusual, wouldn't we? Would we? Yeah, I would. I mean, okay, let's notice verses 27 through 29. They made the tunics of finely woven linen for Aaron and his sons, and the turban of fine linen, and the decorated caps of fine linen, and the fine linen breeches of fine twisted linen, and the sash of fine twisted linen and blue and purple and scarlet material, the work of the weaver, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Okay? I want to go ahead and read 30 and 31 while we're reading. They made the plate of the holy crown of pure gold and inscribed it like the engravings of a signet, holy to the Lord. They fastened the blue cord to it to fasten it on the turban, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Okay? And so this section, verses 27, 28, and 29, continues the description of the making of other priestly garments. Okay, Aaron and his sons all wore tunics, linen breeches, and sashes. Okay, these special garments distinguish them as priests, okay, from the rest of the Israelites. Now, only Aaron, who was the high priest, wore the turban. Okay, whereas his sons wore the decorated caps. Okay. In verses 30 and 31, the description there concludes with an account of the manufacture, if you will, of the golden plate or crown. Okay, if you remember in the instructions of chapter 28, this plate precedes the tunics, caps, linen breeches, and sashes. Okay, the plate of gold was inscribed with what? Holy to the Lord. Okay, holy to the Lord, and it was attached to the high priest's turban. Okay, and so the plate proclaimed that the high priest was holy. All right, and so Aaron and the high priest who followed after him represented Israel when they wore their consecrated garments in God's presence. Okay? Now, the importance of the priestly garments is obvious from the fact that so much space, if you remember us reading back, is given to their description. Okay? These garments were designed by who? God. Okay? The garments were designed by God, set apart, and it set apart the priest for the Lord's service. Okay? All right? All right, let's move on unless somebody would like to add some info there. All right, verses 32 through 43. This will get us through the end of the chapter. Verse 32. Thus all the work of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting was completed, and the sons of Israel did according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, so they did. They brought the tabernacle to Moses, the tent and all its furnishings, its clasp, its boards, its bars, and its pillars and its sockets, and the covering of ram skins dyed red, and the covering of porpoise skins, and the screening veil. The ark of the testimony and its poles and the mercy seat, the table and all its utensils, and the bread of the presence, the pure gold lampstand with its arrangement of lamps, and all its utensils, and the oil for the light, and the gold altar and anointing oil, and the fragrant incense, and the veil for the doorway of the tent, the bronze altar and its bronze grating, its poles and its utensils, the laver and its stand, the hangings for the cord, its pillars and its sockets, and the screen for the gate of the court, its cords and its pegs, and all the equipment for the service of the tabernacle, for the tent of meeting, the woven garments for ministering in the holy place, and the holy garments for Aaron the priest, and the garments of his sons to minister as priests. So the sons of Israel did all the work according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses. And Moses examined all the work, and behold, they had done it, just as the Lord had commanded. This they had done, so Moses blessed them. So Israel had finished their work on the tabernacle, okay? And verse 39 kind of provides a conclusion, I guess, to chapter 39, but it also serves as a climax, if you will, to the entire story of the construction of the tabernacle that we've been reading about in Exodus chapter 35 all the way through 39. Now, if you remember, God gave the instructions in Exodus chapters 25 through 31, and all those instructions had been carried out. Okay? The Bible even says that they did according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, right? Okay? Now, verses 33 through 41 that we read, the fact that they brought the tabernacle to Moses indicates that the parts of the tabernacle were made separately, right? Y'all agree with that? Okay, the parts of the tabernacle were made separately. They were put together after everything had been constructed. We'll get into that when we get into chapter 40. Okay, so they brought the tabernacle and its furnishings to Moses for his approval. Since Moses was God's spokesman, is that correct? It makes sense then that they were also seeking God's approval as well. Would you agree? Yeah, okay. So when we read those verses 30 through 41, they kind of function as a checklist or inventory to demonstrate that everything on the Lord's to-do list had been accomplished, right? Everything had been accomplished. And it emphasizes that Israel made everything that the Lord had asked them to make. Okay? We all understand that God is the one that asked them to make this, right? Okay. So Israel had done all that the Lord required of them in the construction of the tabernacle. Moses looked over the completed work, compared it with the Lord's blueprint, which God had given to Moses, right? Okay? Including what had been shown him on the mountain. We talked about that in chapter 25 and verse 40, and approved of it. Okay? And Moses showed his approval by blessing those who had done the work. Okay? No. Yep. It was completely mobile. Okay, it had to be constructed, and then now, and we'll talk about this when we get into chapter 40. But it took a day to put it together. Okay? Took a whole day to put it together. But yes, it was meant to be taken down so that they can move on. Okay? All right. Anybody got anything they want to add before we get into some? I want to get into some. I want to talk about according to the pattern for just a little bit before we jump into chapter 40. Okay. So in Exodus chapter 25, verses 8 and 9, God told Moses to make the tabernacle according to the pattern. Okay, right? Okay, now apparently, besides the instructions that God gave Moses orally, if you remember, he also showed Moses what you would call a picture or a vision, maybe a visual representation or a model of the tabernacle. Okay, then he told Moses to make the tabernacle according to that pattern. Okay, if you read chapter 25 and verse 40, also you can read about that in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5. Okay, it talks about that that picture that Moses had as it relates to how this was to be done. Okay, the pattern. So as the writer of Hebrews alluded to this event, he indicated that there was a heavenly pattern which served as the model for the earthly tabernacle. Okay? That heavenly pattern, Hebrews says, was the present system which we know as the Christian system. So I want us to notice a couple of things this morning before we move into chapter 40. Number one, it was important for Moses and the Israelites to follow God's instructions in building the tabernacle. Okay? That was important, wasn't it? Okay? Good. Keep that in your mind. Second, if it was important for them to do so, then I guess it would make sense that it is important for us to follow God's instruction in building God's tabernacle, which is the church today. Agree or disagree? Agree. Okay? Good. So Israel was to follow God's pattern in building the tabernacle. Okay? We know, because we have read, we know that it was important for Israel to follow God's instructions because God told them to do so. Correct? Okay? Chapter 25 talks a lot about that, about God giving the instructions and God telling them what needed to be done. Also, Stephen mentions this in Acts chapter 7 when he's given his defense. He mentions this very thing in Acts chapter 7 and verse 44. Okay? If you want to jot that down and read that sometime. Acts chapter 7, where Stephen is giving that defense, is a very, very good chapter of the Bible. Okay? So God gave detailed instructions suggesting that he intended for them to be followed in detail. Does that make sense? Okay? Also, it is evident that following God's instructions to the letter was important for Israel because that is, in fact, what the Israelites did, didn't they? Dale? Exactly. Okay? Right. What happens if you don't follow a blueprint the way it's written? Yeah. Okay. Good point. All right. Good point. So apparently Israel thought that God meant what he said in giving the instructions for the tabernacle because they followed those instructions carefully. And besides that, we know that God was pleased with their careful obedience because he blessed their efforts by entering into the tabernacle that they had built according to the pattern. And we'll get into that probably next week when we get over into chapter 40, okay? God was pleased with that. Now, what does all that mean? Well, what that means is we should follow God's pattern today, right? Okay? The New Testament teaches that the message of God revealed through Christ and his apostles was intended to guide mankind until the end of time. Is that correct? Okay? That's what we have, right? The New Testament, right? Okay? Now, God has given those who desire to follow Christ a pattern, correct? Okay? Just as he gave Israel a pattern, right? Okay? Do you think that God intends for us to follow that pattern? He does. He expects us to follow that pattern. He expects us to obey his commands, okay? Just as God required obedience of Israel, okay? He requires obedience from us, doesn't he? Okay? All right? So that continuing message involves the church, because the church is what saved people are added to. Is that right? Acts chapter 2 and verse 47 specifically talks about that, doesn't it? Okay? The church was built by who? Christ, okay? The church was saved by who? Christ, okay? Matthew chapter 16, Paul talks about that as well in the book of Ephesians. Remember that? Who's the head of the church? Jesus Christ. Colossians 1 verse 18, Paul talks about that very thing, that Christ is the head of the church. So when congregations were established as the result of the preaching of the gospel, they were guided by inspired men, Ephesians chapter 2. And in this way, they were built according to the pattern which God had given. Does that make sense? Okay? God had given the pattern for the way that he wanted his church built. We understand that? Okay? Just like he had given Israel the pattern for the way that he wanted the tabernacle built. Okay? Does that make sense? It does? Okay? Now, these congregations that were built were not perfect, were they? No, they weren't perfect, but they were judged according to the God-given pattern by the apostles and other inspired writers of the New Testament. Okay? All right? And since those early churches were established in accordance with and then judged by a pattern given by God, then Christians today are obligated to follow that same pattern when we establish or build churches. Okay? Y'all agree or disagree? Okay? We must preach the gospel they preached and require of people today what they required then of people to be saved. Right? Okay? We have to recognize the same standard of authority. Okay? And I'm talking about the authority of Jesus Christ as is found in the New Testament. Okay? Yes, sir. That's right. Yeah. Okay. If it kept changing, Troy, it'd be like keeping up with the tax code, wouldn't it? It'd be hard to keep up with. Okay? So, good point, Troy. So, in our congregations, then, we need to have the same worship and the same organization that as was found in the churches of the New Testament. Okay? We have to require the same standards of Christian living that were required of the believers in the first century. Okay? So to follow the New Testament pattern is in fact what those involved in the restoration movement are trying to do, and what we urge all others to do. Okay? Now, to our benefit, God, in His wisdom, has appointed churches to have elders, right? Is that right? Okay. Now, an elder is not only a person who is a mentor, but they are also tasked with being sure that the truth is taught and that we are following God's pattern. Is that correct? And thank God that in this particular congregation we have 3 men that believe that to be true. Okay? It's important that we follow the truth and that we follow God's pattern. Okay? It was important for Israel in building of the tabernacle, and it is of importance to us today to follow that pattern. Now, believe it or not, sometimes people will object to this aim. Okay? People will object to following the truth, to following the pattern that God has described to us in His Word. Okay? There's a few things that they may say, and you may have heard these things before. I don't know. They may say, God would surely not punish people for not following the New Testament. Y'all ever heard that before? Huh? Okay. Yep. You know what our reply should be to that? If God punished people then for not following His pattern, don't you think He's going to punish people today for not following His pattern? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Correct. Correct. Yep. Correct. Yep. Okay. That's right. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Good point. You remember over in the book of Leviticus, chapter 10, I'm pretty sure it was, where Aaron's sons offered up the wrong kind of fire. Y'all remember that? Okay. Now we would think that that's a simple thing, right? That's not a matter of great importance. I mean, wouldn't you? Building a fire. I mean, that's not a matter of great importance that we would think of today, would it be? But didn't God tell them that He wanted a specific type built? What happened to them when they did it the wrong way? They died. Okay? Now, we don't think that we wouldn't think that Aaron's sons deserve the death penalty for building the wrong type of fire, would we? Would we? No. Oh, you wasn't supposed to touch the ark. Yep, they died. Okay? God said, don't do it. And they did it, and there were consequences for that, those things that they did wrong. Okay? Correct. Okay? That's right. That's the big thing. Thank the Lord for the new covenant. Yes, sir.
That wasn't some ill-fated, malicious, arrogant, not listening, not obeying thing that happened.
That's right.
They were trying to protect sacred objects from falling.
Yep.
And that should tell us that innocent as that act was, and he was struck. That should show us beyond question so important that we individually know what the Bible tells us to do.
Yeah.
And in absence of that, or telling us what not to do.
Right.
It
Yeah.
doesn't have to tell us that because it tells us what to do.
Yes.
And that excludes any and everything else, even if it's something so that we would consider, I don't know, the word of God by any means, but, we would think something like that would be ministry, here on earth. I'm not doing anything malicious,
Yeah, you're just trying to protect the ark from falling over.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm just trying to protect it. And it shows the importance of we've got to know because it's that serious.
Yeah.
Regardless of our intentions, good or bad, that's
Good news is, yesterday when we were cleaning the building up out here, we found the Ark of the Covenant. Well, I guess years ago, in the last leaders, there was one of the years that they did the Book of Exodus. They did a study on Exodus, and one of the kids actually made an Ark of the Covenant. And I got it out of there, and I got it back there in the elder's office now. So if y'all want to see it, now I did touch it, and I was okay. So it's probably a replica. All right, so God told Moses and Israel, make all things according to the pattern. Okay? And so we need to be sure that we follow the same principle today. Okay? If we do what people did in New Testament times to become Christians and to worship and live as Christians, then we will be Christians just as they were. Correct? Okay? And in so doing, we will be pleasing to God, because that's what pleases God. Correct? Correct? Yes. Okay? God has certain ways He wants things done, and we need to do it God's way. Okay? Anybody got anything they would like to add to chapter 39 before we move into chapter 40? All right, so chapter 40, which obviously is the last chapter in this great story, the book of Exodus. Chapter 40, provides a fitting conclusion to this book, if you will. Okay, God had delivered Israel out of bondage in Egypt. He had brought his people to Sinai. He had made a covenant with them, and he had given them his law. Now, in spite of the faithlessness of Israel, he had graciously granted them the privilege of building a place where he might dwell among them. Okay, we read about that in Exodus chapter 25, talks specifically about that. And so this last chapter describes how the tabernacle was erected, and then details the climatic moment, if you will, of Israel's adventure. Okay, God's descent to dwell in his house among his people. Okay, so let's notice verses 1 through 8. Okay, chapter 40, verses 1 through 8. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, On the first day of the first month you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. You shall place the ark of the testimony there, and you shall screen the ark with the veil. You shall bring in the table and arrange what belongs on it, and you shall bring in the lampstand and mount its lamps. Moreover, you shall set the gold altar of incense before the ark of the testimony, and set up the veil for the doorway to the tabernacle. You shall set the altar of burnt offering in front of the doorway of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. You shall set the laver between the tent of meeting and the altar, and put water in it. You shall set up the court all around and hang up the veil for the gateway of the court. So, as the chapter begins, okay, if you notice, there is a topic sentence that states who the Lord was speaking to. That would be Moses, right? The Lord was doing the speaking. He was speaking to Moses. He told him what was to be done, okay? Set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and when it was to happen, okay? On the first day of the first month. Now, the first day of the first month refers to the first day of the second year of Israel's deliverance. Okay, verse 17, and when we get over to there, we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, the Israelites, does anybody remember? I probably wouldn't remember this either, but does anybody remember in what month the Israelites had reached Sinai? Let's do some multiple choice. Was it the first month, the second month, or the third month? A, B, or C? Now, don't feel bad. I wouldn't remember that either. Okay? It was the third month. Okay? The Israelites had reached Sinai in the third month. Okay? On that very day, exactly 3 months after they had been delivered from Egypt, that's in chapter 19, if you want to jot that down and go back and read it sometime. Okay? Now, according to the text, Moses was on the mountain how many days? 40 days. All right, y'all keeping up with this now. So we got 90 days to begin with. Now, Moses has been on the mountain 40 days. This was before the golden calf tragedy happened, where the calf just magically appeared out of the fire, right? Is that what happened? Yeah. So after that, then, he spent another 40 days, right, receiving the law a second time. Okay? So if Exodus 19 indicates that about 90 days has elapsed since Israel's exodus from Egypt, and then you have the other two periods of 40 days, that would make a total of how many days? 170, okay? Now, not counting the time that is required, we don't know exactly what that was, time required for additional events, recording in the narrative, Therefore, Israel apparently built the tabernacle in about 6 months. Okay? It took about 6 months, give or take. It's not an exact number of days, but it took about 6 months for them to build the tabernacle. That is, to get it ready to be erected, okay? So, in contrast then to a lengthy construction period of approximately 6 months, the tent could be put up in a day, okay? Yep, in a day. Now, that a specific day was set for the erection of the tabernacle indicates that the construction of the tent was separate, all right, from its erection. Okay, it was two separate events, and that was in keeping with the fact that it would be a portable place of worship, if you will. Okay, it was meant to be portable. So all of the items connected with the tabernacle had already been built, and all that remained was a day of putting the parts together to make the whole. Okay? All right? So in verse 3, after the tent was set up, the furnishings were to be placed in a logical order. To begin with, you had the Ark of the Testimony. It was to be put in the most what? Holy place, okay? The most holy place. The Ark of the Covenant is called the Ark of the Testimony because it contained the 2 stone tablets of the law and bore witness to God's covenant with his people. Okay, right? Now the next thing is the veil separating the most holy place from the holy place was to be hung. Okay? Then in verse 4 and 5, the furniture which belonged in the holy place was to be installed. The table with the bread of the presence, the lampstand with its 7 lamps, and the gold altar of incense. Okay? Then the veil, or the screen that covered the entrance to the holy place, could be hung. Okay? How was it torn? Top to bottom. Okay? Top to bottom. All right? So next then, verses 6 through 8, attention turned to the court outside of the tent. Okay? The first thing that's mentioned is the bronze altar of burnt offering, which was to be placed in front of the doorway of the tabernacle of meeting. And then water, the laver then was to be set between the tent of meeting and the altar, and water was to be poured into it, right? And then finally, the fence around the court was to be put up, and the veil which served as the entrance into the courtyard was to be hung. Okay? So, that being said, next week we will begin in verse 9 because we got about a minute left, and that would be almost impossible to cover 9 through 15 in 1 minute. Okay? So next week we'll start. I want y'all to do something for me. Obviously, it's not going to take the whole class time to get through chapter 40, so think about